People always say you never truly understand someone's character until you watch how they act when they think your property is theirs to use. I found out exactly what that meant in Cedar Hollow, Missouri. It all began with a trailer parked like it had every right to be there, as if my property line was nothing more than an imaginary line nobody had to respect. At first, I caught myself wondering if I was making too much of it. Maybe it was only temporary. Maybe whoever owned it would move it before long. That assumption couldn't have been more wrong. My name is Caleb Mercer, and I've always considered myself a patient man. I usually let little annoyances slide because keeping life peaceful seemed more important than winning every small battle. But eventually those little problems pile up until they become impossible to ignore. It was near the end of spring when I noticed the trailer for the very first time. I had taken my dog, Boomer, behind the house just after sunrise like I did every morning. There was a mug of coffee in my hand, his leash in the other, and I was still shaking off the sleep when something unusual caught my eye. A long flatbed trailer was parked partly across the gravel strip beside the fence near the alley. I stopped and stared for a second, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. It wasn't completely on my property, yet it definitely wasn't completely off it either. It sat right across that invisible boundary people suddenly pretend not to understand whenever it's convenient for them. I figured someone must have left it there for a quick construction project, or maybe a landscaping crew working nearby had dropped it off for the day. I convinced myself it would disappear before lunchtime. Didn't. When I looked again that evening, it hadn't moved an inch. Same position, same silence, almost like it had already decided that was where it belonged. Even then, I didn't let it bother me too much. Running a small repair business from the back of my property kept me busy enough. I chalked it up as a temporary inconvenience and focused on my work instead of making a fuss. But on the third morning, I walked over for a closer look, coffee already cold in my hand. And that's when I realized the tires were resting a couple of feet inside my gravel strip. It wasn't anything fancy, just a stretch of compacted gravel I had installed years earlier, so I could move equipment without getting stuck in the mud. Still, it was my land. I'd paid for it, surveyed it, marked every boundary, and suddenly it felt like someone had decided to park part of their life on top of it without asking for permission. I started asking neighbors about it in a friendly way. Nothing confrontational, just casual conversations over fences and driveways. That's when someone told me the trailer belonged to a man named Darren Pike, who owned a landscaping business a couple of streets away. Apparently Darren had developed a reputation for leaving his trailer wherever he found an empty space between jobs. And somehow that empty space had become my gravel strip. The strange part was how everyone talked about it like it was perfectly normal, almost as if I was being unreasonable for even mentioning it. I ignored it the first few times because I honestly didn't want to create conflict over a patch of gravel. But the trailer kept returning. Sometimes it was empty. Other times it was loaded with mowers, fuel cans, and equipment clanking every time the wind picked up, turning my property into an unofficial storage yard. Every visit left deeper impressions. The wheels slowly pressed into the gravel, creating ruts that collected rainwater after every shower. Before long, I noticed other inconveniences. The trailer blocked my back gate just enough to make opening it awkward, and my delivery driver had to back up multiple times because there wasn't enough room for an easy approach. None of those issues were dramatic by themselves, but together they became a constant irritation that never really went away. One morning, I finally reached my limit. I was expecting a heavy pallet delivery from my repair shop, and naturally the trailer was sitting there again, occupying the exact space I needed. I walked up the dirt path behind Darren's property and knocked on his front door. He answered with an easy smile, acting like we were longtime neighbors. Before I could explain why I was there, he commented on the weather and casually wiped the sweat from his forehead. I politely explained that his trailer was sitting on my property and that I needed him to move it. He looked honestly surprised, as though the possibility had never crossed his mind. He shrugged and said, "I didn't think it was bothering anyone. I'm only parking it there between jobs. I'll make sure I'm more careful." For a moment, I believed him. People can sound very sincere when they're standing face to face with you. For about a week, the trailer disappeared, and I almost felt guilty for bringing it up in the first place. Then it came right back. Same location. No message. No warning. It was as though we'd never had the conversation at all. This time it stayed there for 5 straight days. Then the rain came. Not a violent storm, just the kind of steady Midwest rain that slowly wears down your patience. The trailer sank farther into the gravel, leaving deeper grooves behind. When the weather finally cleared, my once solid gravel strip had become a patchwork of muddy trenches filled with standing water. I stood there that evening staring at the damage, realizing how something so small had gradually taken over my property without ever causing one single dramatic incident. That night, I opened the metal filing cabinet in my garage, pulled out the property records, and unfolded the survey maps from the day I bought the place. The following morning, I walked every boundary again to make sure I hadn't imagined any of it. Every survey pin was exactly where it belonged. There was no doubt anymore. The gravel strip was completely inside my property line. So I snapped a clear picture of the survey marker, zoomed in on the boundary pin, and sent the photo to Darren along with. I sent him a calm, respectful message. There was no anger in it, no accusations, just a simple request. Please don't park your trailer on my property anymore. A few minutes later, my phone buzzed with his reply. It was nothing but a thumbs-up emoji. No apology. No explanation. No sign that he even understood why I was frustrated. Just a tiny digital gesture that somehow said more than an entire paragraph could have. I found myself staring at that screen far longer than I should have because it felt less like agreement and more like being brushed aside. About 2 weeks later, the trailer was back. It was parked in the exact same place, as if our conversation had never happened. No warning, no text, no courtesy, just another piece of metal sitting on my land like it belonged there. That was the moment something changed inside me. It wasn't really anger. It was something quieter than that. A kind of certainty that settles in when you finally realize someone hasn't misunderstood you at all. They've simply decided your concerns don't matter. That afternoon, I called a towing company. At first, I wasn't even committed to having it removed. I was only asking questions. If a trailer is parked on private property without permission, what are the rules? What proof would I need? Could it legally be towed? The man on the phone answered without hesitation. As long as I could document the property boundary and the trailer wasn't protected by some legal exception, they could remove it. That answer was enough. I spread my property survey across the kitchen table again and slowly traced the boundary line with my finger, reminding myself that I wasn't being unreasonable. For the first time since all this started, I stopped worrying about being overly polite. The next time the trailer appeared, I didn't walk over to Darren's house. I didn't send another text. Instead, I carried out a notice I had printed that morning. Bright paper, large bold letters, private property, unauthorized vehicles subject to towing. I secured it directly to the trailer hitch where nobody could pretend they hadn't seen it. Then I stood there for a moment, half expecting my phone to ring or Darren to come walking over for another conversation. Nothing happened. The trailer stayed exactly where it was, silent and unmoving, almost as if it believed it could simply outlast me. 2 full days passed like that. Without even realizing it, I kept glancing at it from my porch every time I walked outside, like I was watching a countdown I never wanted to begin. On the second evening, I caught myself thinking, this is ridiculous. It's only a trailer. But deep down I knew it had stopped being about the trailer a long time ago. The line had been crossed too many times for this to still be called a misunderstanding. Now it was about choices. By the 3rd morning after posting the warning, I already knew exactly what I was going to do. Not because I was furious, because there simply wasn't any uncertainty left. I woke up before sunrise. My coffee was still steaming, and the whole neighborhood sat in that quiet stillness small towns have before the day begins. I stood at the kitchen window staring at that gravel strip, feeling like it had somehow become a test I never asked to take. The trailer hadn't moved. Same position. Same stubborn reminder that Darren apparently believed my property only mattered if I was willing to defend it every single time. So I called the towing company again. The same employee answered the phone. I told him plainly, the trailer is still here. I've got the survey. I've posted the notice. I'm ready. He didn't sound surprised. He simply replied, "All right, we'll send someone over." There wasn't any drama in his voice, and somehow that made everything feel even more final. For him, it was probably another routine service call. For me, it felt like crossing a line I'd been standing beside for weeks. After hanging up, I walked outside with my hands in my pockets and listened to the breeze moving through the fence. That's when it hit me that most disputes don't explode all at once. They quietly build until someone finally decides enough is enough. Less than an hour later, the tow truck rolled slowly down the alley. It was a large flatbed, moving with the confidence of someone who had done this countless times before. The driver climbed out carrying a clipboard. He wasn't interested in hearing my side of the story. He only wanted the paperwork. I handed him a copy of the survey, showed him the property markers, and pointed out the exact boundary line. He looked it over, nodded once, and got to work. Later on, that simple nod stayed with me more than anything else. To him, this was ordinary. To Darren, it would soon become a problem. But to me, it had been weeks of frustration finally reaching an ending. He attached the chains with practiced movements while the hydraulic system hissed quietly in the background. As the trailer slowly lifted off the gravel, I could clearly see the deep grooves its tires had left behind. It looked almost like uncovering a scar after removing the thing that caused it. There were no raised voices, no dramatic confrontation, just steady machinery doing exactly what it was supposed to do. Within a few minutes, the trailer disappeared down the alley, leaving my property behind. As it rolled away, I realized I'd been carrying tension for months without noticing. For the first time in a long while, I could finally breathe. I stood there looking at the empty gravel strip. Nothing about the scene was exciting. It simply looked the way it should have looked all along. Later that evening, I was inside my garage repairing a generator when someone knocked firmly on the side door. The sound wasn't especially loud, but it cut through the quiet. Before I even opened it, I already knew who was standing outside. It was Darren. He didn't look furious. He looked tense, like someone trying to regain control of a situation that had already slipped beyond his reach. The first thing he asked was where his trailer had gone. He asked where his trailer had gone, and for just a brief moment I almost felt bad for him. It was obvious he genuinely hadn't expected things to end this way. Somewhere along the line, he'd convinced himself I would simply keep putting up with it forever. I answered calmly. It was removed from my property after being parked there repeatedly without permission. He stared at me for a second, as though the words took a moment to sink in. Then his expression hardened, and he quietly said, "You didn't have to take it that far." That sentence told me everything. To Darren, I'd crossed a line. To me, I had finally enforced one. He lingered in the doorway for another few seconds, almost like he expected me to back down, soften my position, or offer some kind of compromise. I didn't. I simply rested against the doorframe and said, "I asked you more than once not to leave it there." That was the entire conversation. Without another word, he turned around and walked back down the driveway. There was a stiffness in the way he moved, the kind people have when they suddenly realize something they always treated as negotiable never actually was. Later that evening, the towing company called to confirm he had collected the trailer. He'd paid the towing bill along with the storage fees. I remember sitting there thinking about how expensive assumptions become once they run into clearly marked boundaries. The next several days were completely quiet. No trailer. No interruptions. Just my gravel strip exactly the way it was supposed to be. I'll admit, part of me kept expecting it to return. Habits like that usually don't disappear overnight. But it never did. Instead, I found myself noticing my own property differently. It was almost like I'd spent so much time living around the problem that I'd forgotten what normal actually looked like. About a week later, Darren came back. This time, though, he wasn't there looking for an argument. He stopped several feet away from my door with his hands tucked into his pockets and politely asked whether he could ever use that space again if he asked permission first. There wasn't any hostility in his voice. If anything, he sounded careful, almost as though he hoped there was still a version of this story where none of the earlier conflict had happened. I paused before answering, not because I was uncertain, because I wanted to answer honestly without making it personal. I told him no, not out of revenge. Not because I was still upset, but because once someone's behavior becomes a repeated pattern, the issue stops being about permission and starts being about respect. And that part had already been damaged beyond repair. He slowly nodded. Whether he truly agreed or not, I couldn't tell. Then he turned around and walked away without trying to change my mind. After he left, I stood outside looking at the empty gravel strip again. It amazed me how something so small had occupied so much of my attention for so many weeks. People rarely respect boundaries until ignoring them finally comes with consequences. After everything settled down, I realized closure doesn't usually arrive with some dramatic feeling of victory. Most of the time it simply feels like pressure slowly disappearing, like fixing a slow leak that you've almost forgotten was there. Back at home, I started noticing ordinary things again. The breeze moved freely through the backyard without a large trailer blocking the open space. Boomer stopped hesitating near the back gate as if expecting another obstacle to be waiting there. That small change affected me more than I expected because it made me realize I'd quietly adjusted my own routines around someone else's disrespect without ever recognizing it. One Saturday morning, I decided to restore the gravel properly. I didn't just rake the surface smooth. I rebuilt the damaged sections, spread fresh stone where the tires had sunk too deeply, and reshaped the drainage edge so rainwater would flow away instead of collecting in muddy ruts. By then, it wasn't about frustration anymore. It felt like reclaiming a part of my everyday life that I'd gradually given up. While I was working, Walter, an older neighbor from across the alley who usually kept to himself, wandered over. He nodded toward the gravel and casually said, "I saw the tow truck. Figured it was only a matter of time." There wasn't any judgment in his voice, just the quiet certainty of someone who had watched the whole situation unfold from a distance, the way people often do in small towns. I asked him directly whether he thought I'd overreacted. He leaned against the fence for a moment before answering. Then he said something I still remember. People think property lines are flexible until they're the ones losing part of their own land. That simple observation stayed with me. It wasn't taking my side or Darren's. It was just the truth from someone who had probably witnessed plenty of neighbor disputes over the years. A few days later, I noticed Darren driving past my property. He slowed down slightly but never stopped. There wasn't any trailer behind his truck this time. He simply looked straight ahead with both hands on the steering wheel. Neither of us waved. Neither of us acknowledged the other. But there wasn't any bitterness left in that silence. Only distance. And somehow that distance felt healthier than all the forced politeness that had come before. That's when I finally realized the conflict was over. Not because anyone had won an argument. Because one person had finally accepted the boundary and stopped trying to push beyond it. Even after everything settled, though, I still caught myself replaying the beginning of it all from time to time. Especially, I still think about that thumbs up emoji sometimes. Looking back, it's strange how something so small ended up carrying so much weight. That single symbol was probably the exact moment our conversation stopped being a real conversation. It wasn't just a reply. It was the point where I realized my words weren't actually being taken seriously anymore. If I'm being truthful, I also spent time wondering whether I could have handled things differently. Not because I regretted how everything turned out. I simply wondered if there had ever been a version of the story where it didn't have to reach the point of calling a tow truck. Maybe I should have been firmer from the beginning. Maybe letting it slide for so long only encouraged it. Or maybe, if Darren had asked instead of assuming he could use my property whenever he wanted, none of this would have happened in the first place. But that's the problem with maybe. It only exists in stories where people make different choices than the ones they actually made. 1 month passed. Then another. Life gradually slipped back into its normal routine. I worked mornings, spent afternoons fixing equipment, and enjoyed quiet evenings where the loudest sound was usually the porch light clicking on as the sun disappeared. The gravel strip stayed exactly the way it was supposed to. No fresh tire marks. No deep ruts. No unexpected trailer showing up again. Just an empty stretch of ground doing what it had always been meant to do when people respected it. Eventually, I noticed something else. I stopped looking out the window to check on it every day. That small change probably told me more than anything else. One evening, I was sitting outside watching the sun disappear behind the trees when a thought crossed my mind. Most conflicts never feel like stories while you're living through them. They feel like interruptions, like someone quietly stealing pieces of your time without asking. Only after everything settles down do we start turning those moments into lessons, trying to decide who was right, who was wrong, and who came out ahead. Real life rarely fits into those simple categories. A few days later, I found a small envelope in my mailbox. There was nothing official about it. Just a handwritten note from Darren. It wasn't long. He wrote that he understood the situation much better now. He admitted he hadn't realized how far the trailer had actually crossed onto my property. He also mentioned that he'd changed the way he stored his equipment so something like this wouldn't happen again. There wasn't any dramatic apology. No excuses. No attempt to shift the blame. Just simple acknowledgement. I held that note in my hands longer than I expected. Not because it changed anything that had already happened, but because it confirmed something I'd been thinking for a while. Most people don't change because they lose an argument. They change because they finally experience consequences they can't ignore. I never wrote back. Not out of resentment. There simply wasn't anything left that needed to be said. The property line had already spoken clearly enough for both of us. If there's one lesson I carried away from all of it, it's this. In small communities, respect isn't usually built through big speeches or dramatic moments. It's built in ordinary situations where people decide whether someone else's boundary deserves to be honored or quietly ignored. Once you recognize that difference, it's hard to ever look at those situations the same way again. Even now, when I walk past that gravel strip in the evening and see it sitting clean, level, and untouched, one question still comes to mind. At what point does patience stop being a virtue and start becoming permission? I'd honestly like to know what you think. Everyone seems to draw that line in a different place, and it usually depends on which side of the boundary they're standing on.